Thank you. I'm told I've got about 10 minutes, and I haven't got any notes or anything. I'm doing this from the top of my head, so I'm going to try and stick to my 10 minutes. Or if I get kicked off, I'll just get kicked off. It's happened before. I'm going to talk about creativity and inspiration, and of course, like everybody else who spoke, it's personal, really. Where do great ideas come from? When this idea was put to me, I thought, I get asked this question all the time. People say to me, where do you get your inspiration from? Well, the answer I always give is, if I knew where I got my inspiration from, I'd go there, wouldn't I? You know what I mean? I'd just go there and live there and be forever inspired. So it's much more complex than that. And one of the other things I was asked was, do I need any props? Do I need any video? Any stuff like that? Well, no. I'm using words, and I'm going to be talking about words. It would be really strange if I was talking about words and I had to use lots of other stuff to explain what the words were. You know, these are words, you see, because I come from the oral tradition. This is spoken word. And this is the first tradition. I think the tongue was the very first instrument. And it was, the oral tradition was the way that we started communicating with each other, the way that we started telling stories to each other. A lot of people think the oral tradition is a kind of Asian, African thing. But no, Europe had a really big, really strong oral tradition. And some people would argue, and I do certainly, that, you know, parts of Scotland and Ireland still have a strong oral tradition. But in the 15th century, they had this thing that was invented called a printing press, and the oral tradition, to a certain extent, started to kind of die out. But it's still alive, and it keeps going. But when I started doing what I do, I didn't wake up one day and go, you know what, I want to join the oral tradition. You know, I just loved using words. I didn't call it poetry. I called it playing with words. I just loved the way that words sounded. I loved the rhythm you could create with words. I love rhyme. In fact, my parents said at one point they were thinking of sending me to a child psychiatrist, because when other boys were happy to be playing with guns and action men, if anybody remembers them, or dolls or whatever it was, I could be found in a corner just nodding my head, just banging out some wicked rhythm. And so they thought that something was wrong with me, you know, but I just discovered and loved words. When I was in the playground, in primary school, I should say, that I just loved being in the playground, and they used to have this game called Kiss Chase. Anybody here play Kiss Chase? Yeah. Some of you look like you're still playing it. But, you know, it's a very popular game. I didn't play that. You see, like what I used to do, I used to go to a girl, I'd say, what's your name? She'd tell me her name, and I'd just freestyle a poem. Then I get a kiss, you see. Sometimes I got a slap, but sometimes I got a kiss. I just loved playing with words. Interestingly enough, I remember in secondary school, a teacher once said that, tomorrow, boys and girls, we are going to be doing poetry. And I thought, yes, this is it. This is secondary school. And now I can get serious with my poetry. I can bring my poetry from the primary school playground into the secondary school classroom. And the next day, I came to school with some poems in my back pocket. And the teacher was wandering around, and when I caught her attention, I said, Miss, do you like poetry? And she said, no, I can't stand it. I only do it because it's part of English and it's part of my job. And you know, I was so deflated. I just kept my poems in my pocket, and I just, then I kind of wandered into this world where all these teenage boys are kind of playing football or chasing girls. And somehow I found this other boy that liked poetry. And we were like a gay couple. You know, like, we used to go into a corner of the playground, and I'd say, you show me yours and I'll show you mine. And we would like read poems to each other. And we were in this like little world of our own, and we thought that nobody could understand us. And later on, as I started to get older, I started to notice things in the world, things that for some reason I wasn't really noticing before, like racism, corruption. I started to experience police brutality. I started to see images of people starving around the world. And then suddenly I thought, I've got to take this stuff that I love doing, playing with words now, and put some real meaning into it, and be really creative, if you like, and tell not just the story of these people, because one of the things I really didn't like doing was claiming to represent people. I hated when I was living in Birmingham in Handsworth and there was like riots and uprisings and all this kind of stuff going on there. And I hated when the next day you'd get some priest or some so-called community representative, community leader claiming to represent me, claiming to represent us. And so I never wanted to take up that role. I wanted to speak about my conditions, how I was being policed, the kind of housing that we were living in, and the kind of racism that I was experiencing. So I started to talk about that in my poetry. And then I started to connect with people. And in fact, when I started doing my poetry, it was on sound systems, for those of you that ever understand the big reggae sound system that were kind of playing Jamaican music. And it was called dub poetry because we was putting that poetry on top of music. It wasn't called rapping then, it wasn't called MCing then. Some people called it toasting. But it was really dub music with poetry. And I felt that I had something to say about the world, and that was the important thing to me. One of the other questions I was asked is, why is it that I love words? I love words because we all have them. You know, we all have them. When I go on stage and I stand there and I perform, and sometime before the performance, I look at the empty hall and I think, you know, nothing happens here unless I go on there and use my words. No props, no anything. And this, as I just said, comes from the oral tradition, one of the first things that we were ever doing as a species. And with almost every new invention, people say that the spoken word, the oral tradition is going to die. And with all the stuff we got now, every night people go out all around the world to listen to people speaking poetry. So I love words because we all have them. I think it's the most democratic art form. It's been scientifically proven that every one of you, every day, will think of a phrase, or sometimes you'll say it, or a sentence that is unique to you. It will never be said by you again for the rest of your life, and probably never be said by anybody else. That's amazing. All the poet is doing is taking these words and remembering them or writing them down. When you watch a great poet, you sit there and you think, why didn't I say that? Why didn't I write it? You know that as a great poet. When you see a great poet, you think that seems so easy. Just go into a library and look at all the books. Just think about the English language here. If you go into a library and look at all those books and then think about the alphabet, 26 letters, and all we are doing is rearranging them. That's quite amazing. That shows you how creative the human brain is. In fact, they say that, well, they haven't said, they have shown, but when you are being creative, there's a part of the brain that sparks up, that lights up. And I've actually seen it. It's like little electrical pulses and they start dancing around. It's quite amazing, and we all do it. Some people just do it more than others. So we can all be creative. And we can all be poets. In fact, I think we all are poets. The amount of people that come to me and go, well, Benjamin, I've wrote a poem and I want to be a poet. I said, that's a contradiction. You've wrote a poem, so you are a poet. It's as simple as that. You shouldn't, you know, when you come from the oral tradition, if anybody here that's ever been to Jamaica, been to Africa or the other Caribbean islands, tell somebody you're a poet. They don't say, so what have you had published? They say, do it. You know, they stand there, and if you can't do it, you're not backing yourself up. So for me, poetry is just human beings being creative with words. You know, a friend of mine who's no longer with us, Adrian Mitchell, said something. Well, he wrote a poem, and I think it's one of the greatest poems ever written. It's one of the shortest poems ever written. The original version of it is only 3 lines. 1 line. The second line is just 1 word. And the third line is just the first line with a slight change. And it's most people ignore most poetry because most poetry ignores most people. See? And our job, I believe, is to create poetry that people don't ignore, that really connects with people, that is not pretentious. You know, I was hanging out in Cambridge one day. Anybody here from Cambridge? Yeah, good. I was hanging out in Cambridge one day with some professors and dons, because they're the kind of people I hang out with, right? And we were rowing a boat down a river slowly. Us educated people call it punting. But it's really rowing a boat down a river slowly. And this professor turned around to me and he said, Benjamin, I think I've got this great idea. I think we should make you into a professor of poetry here at Trinity College, Cambridge. And I went, yeah, prof, yeah. I like the idea of that. I started to imagine my headed notepaper, you know. Professor Benjamin Obadiah Iqbal Zephaniah Didred Don Honorary, you know what I mean? And I like the sound of that. And, but he said to me, he said, Benjamin, there is a problem with your poetry. I said, yeah, prof, what's the problem, man? Help me out here. He said, Benjamin, the problem with your poetry is that people understand it. And I went, oh, shit, that's not good, you know. I said, what do I have to do? He said, well, Benjamin, you've got to write poetry that people don't understand. This was his idea of poetry. He said, you've got to go into the world. That's anywhere outside Cambridge, right? You go there. And you start to observe things that are simple, and you write about them and make them sound complicated. And I thought, yeah, okay. So I started to travel around the country and I started to observe. You know, I went onto the high street and I started observing. I went into the post office where normal people buy stamps or change a gyro or whatever it is they do in post offices now. I just went into my post office and I just observed. It's when I realized that the poet is different from normal people, because normal people just watch and see and look, but the poet observes. And I thought that I've got to take this down to street level, down to grassroots level. I should take it down to the kind of level where I could get a grant, you know, and I went down to Brixton Police Station and I started to observe Brixton Police Station. And then I noticed everybody in the police station observing me. And I thought, Lord, this place is full of poets. You know, I have found my people. You know, we can all be creative, the truth is. You know, we can all be creative. We are all using words. Even those people that can't speak use words. You know, and what I say to you, this is my message to you, is that stay creative in whatever way you can. And it doesn't matter how you do it. If it's listening to it, if it's writing it, if it's, you know, dancing to it, always make sure that you have a bit of poetry in your life. It's like, it's really, really sexy. Thank you very much. I'm out of here.